I am Emma, 27F, and around 2 weeks ago, Caleb, my 5-year boyfriend, proposed to me. Caleb is 27M, and naturally, I answered yes. Our families were delighted both separately. I had especially been looking forward to an engagement party, which my parents insisted on organizing for us. Everything appeared to be in place, until a few days ago, when my parents called off the entire celebration. Why? Since Rachel, 25F, my younger sister, recently went through a breakup, and to my folks that seemed like a good justification for postponing things. They never even inquired of me. As if Rachel's relationship issues were somehow more crucial than my engagement, they immediately called me up and said, "Oh, Rachel is heartbroken, so we think it's best not to talk about the wedding until she's feeling better." Now, let me clear something. I would have understood if they had first discussed with me. I adore my sister. Still, they didn't. They just called off the celebration they had promised me without even thinking about my feelings about it. If it came down to it, I would have been good paying for the party myself. However, this was not about money. It was about a promise broken. It stung. The party was scheduled for yesterday, and we had already issued invites a week ago. Though it wasn't like I was hoping for a huge celebration, it still hurt that everything was called off so quickly. And all because Rachel, who had only been seeing her boyfriend for 8 months, was devastated. Honestly, it didn't seem fair. Rachel was the one hurrying things. She was heartbroken as, just after finding out about my engagement, she had asked her partner whether they were going to get married soon. I suppose that spooked him as he broke up with her the next day. I cannot even attribute blame to him. According to what I know, she ignored his several requests to slow down. Thus, indeed, he had no responsibility for the separation. It was not even wholly hers, but it definitely wasn't mine. What really got to me was how my parents managed the whole matter. I informed them their behavior was petty and immature, not fair. They objected to that, and we got into a major argument. Not since then have we talked. Since I still intended to have the party, I had to personally write every attendee informing them it was permanently postponed. Just not with my parents involved. The one person I hadn't sent an invitation to, though, was my Aunt Susan, Dad's elder sister. Living a little off-grid, she is 62F. None of social media, none of texting. You have to call her in the traditional manner. I suppose my parents and I neglected to invite her when everything collapsed in the turmoil. Well, guess what? She surprised me yesterday when she showed up at my parents' place. A little background. My dad, 51M, is the youngest of 3 siblings. Aunt Susan is severe, independent, and most importantly, she has a big legacy that my dad has always depended on. My parents were not thrilled about it. Aunt Susan is the only one remaining after a few years ago his middle brother died. She never had children or a marriage, but she is a successful entrepreneur who has amassed somewhat over the years. Since their parents were elderly and lacked the stamina to take care of him, Aunt Susan essentially raised my dad growing up. Mom constantly watched care for him because of this. Even far into adulthood, my dad has always imagined that he will get everything when Mom dies. He felt safe in that understanding, as she had addressed it with him before. Now, with everything going on, that's not a given. When Aunt Susan got to my parents' house, they explained the reason the engagement party had been called off. Thinking that was logical, they most likely expected her to side with them. But Aunt Susan was rather angry. That they would treat me like that astounded her. She arrived right at my house after giving my folks an earful without skipping a beat. I have always gotten along great with Aunt Susan, even if we don't chat very frequently. I could always count on her, and she arrived without wasting time. She advised me to be firm and not let my parents treat me this way. "Emma, you deserve better than this, and if they can't see that, they don't deserve to be part of your wedding," she added. I was surprised, as Aunt Susan has always had a terrific connection with my dad, or so I thought. She appeared, however, quite genuinely disturbed. She informed me that as the eldest sister, she had given a lot for my dad and their other brother, but her parents never valued it. I asked her what was really going on. She did so without protest, as they constantly believed it was her obligation to put her younger brothers first. Looking back, though, she regrets it. She was too busy tending to everyone else, so she believes she lost out on her own life. Hearing her say that made me realize something significant even now. Always her reaching out to my dad, never the other way around, unless he needs anything. I wanted to avoid the same blunders she committed. I wanted to stop forgiving my parents only because they were relatives. As they say, relatives can use you if you allow them. And that was just what I was experiencing following that chat with Aunt Susan. Everything started to clear cut. She had offered me a viewpoint I hadn't thought about before that let me see I was going to make the same mistakes she had done with my father and their family. I had to be strong and establish limits. That evening, when Aunt Susan departed, I stayed up in bed considering everything. I understood that I would be the family doormat for the rest of my life if I let things slide right now. I would keep condoning the actions of my parents, and they would continue to profit from my pardon. I sent a note to my parents and Rachel the next morning, unable to let that happen, especially not over something as important as my engagement and marriage. They wouldn't be part of my wedding unless they admitted and apologized for what they had done. Though direct, it had to be stated. Acting as though everything was good when it wasn't piqued my curiosity. Aunt Susan phoned later that morning to check on me, and I informed her what I had done if they had no place at my wedding and lacked respect for my decisions. She sounded like a proud person. "I'm glad Emma stood up for herself," she remarked. "Family cannot stroll all over you simply because you allow them. Stand your ground." Her support meant a lot to me, especially because things with my parents were so precarious. That same day, something unanticipated happened. Not at all like him, my dad came up at my door. Seeing him startled me, particularly given we hadn't talked since the argument. Standing outside, he seemed a little nervous. I could tell right away he wasn't here to apologize when I opened the door. "Is Aunt Susan still here? Not even considering little gestures?" he asked. She had departed earlier in the morning, I informed him, and he seemed somewhat agitated. "She's really upset," he said. "That hit me like a ton of bricks when she contacted me after she departed and said she was changing her will. I had not anticipated this developing into Aunt Susan's legacy. Apparently, though, she had told my dad straight out last night that she was unhappy with his treatment of her. She was thus considering leaving everything to me rather than him. My dad was enraged. He charged me with turning Aunt Susan against him. "Emma, you have always been near to her," he said. "Did you ask her to cut me out? Was this done for a specific goal?" What I was hearing astounded me. In front of me, my father was standing, accusing me of leveraging his connection with his own sister for financial gain. It was ludicrous, and I told him straightforwardly, "Dad, I didn't say anything to Aunt Susan to make her alter her mind. She is unhappy with you not because I asked her to amend her will, but more because of how you treated me. It is your own doing." He did not take it well. His annoyance erupted and he began yelling at me out there on my front porch. "You have turned the only family I have against me," he shouted. "You have wrecked everything. You have no idea what you have done." I stood there startled. The man in front of me was wounded, not only enraged. Still, the truth was I was not the one starting all of this. Aunt Susan had been driven away by his behavior. We had come here via his actions. Still, he cannot see it. "Dad, this is not about me. You did this. None of this would have happened if you had simply apologized and respected me." But he wasn't listening. He persisted, reminding me that what I had done was far worse than postponing an engagement party. When all I had done was stand up for myself after being let down by my parents, he made it sound as though I had planned some great scheme to acquire Aunt Susan's money. Eventually, enough. I advised him to head off. Not like this, not over something as ludicrous as an inheritance. I wanted to stop battling with him. "Go home, Dad," I urged with great conviction. That ought to have been the end of it, but instead my dad started weeping. "Sort things out with Aunt Susan if you can, but don't come here blaming me for your mistakes." Just right on my front porch. It threw me totally, as I had never seen him weep like that before. He was desperate, not only enraged now. For a brief period, I felt bad since he continued stating that I had turned the only family he had left against him and that everything was coming apart. Perhaps I could have behaved differently. Perhaps I should have followed up with him following the argument with Aunt Susan to assist to clear things. But then I thought back on the way Mom and he had handled me and how they had discounted my involvement in Rachel's split. He finally departed, still angry, but not before informing me that if I had only phoned him last night, all of this might have been prevented. I knew this was not my fault. Even now, some years after he left, his comments stayed with me for the whole day. If I had contacted him, maybe things might have turned out differently. Unfortunately, I did not, and I wasn't sure whether I regretted it. That night, Caleb came home and I told him everything. He told me I hadn't done anything illegal, but it nevertheless lingered in the rear of my mind. I had not wanted things to have progressed this far. Though I knew I couldn't turn back now, I hadn't wanted to be the cause my father was failing apart. Aunt Susan was correct. I had to ground myself. Family or not, I deserved to be treated with respect. If they couldn't, they didn't deserve to be a part of my life or my wedding. I wish I could say things calmed down after that fight with my dad, but they did not. They really just got worse. A few days went by, and while I was still working through the conflict with my dad, Rachel and both of my parents decided to further aggravate things. They went public with their complaints, not content to let things go. It began with little matters. Messages from far-off relatives wondering about what had transpired between me and my parents started arriving. They had been telling everyone, apparently, that I had coerced Aunt Susan into eliminating my dad from her will. They said I had indoctrinated Aunt Susan into thinking my parents were the bad guys and blown the entire engagement party cancellation out of proportion. Initially, I disregarded it as they were depicting me as some bitter daughter seeking retribution for not getting her party. I felt no need to defend myself as I knew the truth would show up finally. But as more and more relatives began contacting me to find out what was going on, I discovered that my parents were aggressively latching others to their side. I knew I had to say something since they were disseminating their version of events like wildfire, and I looked like the evil guy. Playing defense and constantly having to defend myself became old to me. I thus issued a public comment on social media. Though I omitted all the unpleasant details, I made it plain that I hadn't done anything to merit the way my parents were treating me or turned Aunt Susan against them. I felt that would be the end of it, as the engagement party cancellation was about broken promises and a lack of respect, not only about a party. As it happens, though, my parents were not done. Rachel joined in the campaign against me a few days later. She began sending passive-aggressive, ambiguous notes on her social media, implying that I was selfish and callous for not realizing how upset she was over her split. She said that my parents had been very right in calling off the celebration due to her sadness, and that I had no sympathy for her circumstances. The saddest part, people began to hold them true. Suddenly, I was the unappreciative daughter turning on her parents, and the cold-blooded sister unconcerned about Rachel's feelings. It was much more than annoying. Caleb, bless him, stayed by me through all of this. My parents and Rachel were spinning the story, making themselves out to be the victims, while all I had done was ask for some fundamental respect. He was constantly telling me that I had no need to defend myself to those ignorant of the whole truth. If they truly loved me, he added, they would have contacted me on my side before making snap decisions. One of my cousins contacted me to let me know that my parents had been contacting everyone on the guest list for the wedding, advising them to boycott the event, so the situation reached a boiling point. He was right, of course. They sought to undermine my marriage. My cousin claims that by excluding me from the wedding, my parents were disrespecting people entirely and causing great sadness among them. It was a disaster. They were encouraging people not to turn up in order to show unity with them. I thought I was inside some twisted soap show. Having previously offended me with their cancellation of my engagement party, my parents were now actively working to destroy my wedding. That's when I knew things had gone too far. That is, after I had stood up to them and refused to allow them to treat me like a doormat. Though my parents had crossed a boundary, I had been attempting to be cordial, to manage everything with grace. I so gave Aunt Susan a call. Though I wanted her aid, I had not intended to pull her into the heart of this disaster any more than she already was. Aunt Susan was enraged as I went over all that had been happening, the public reaction, family strife, and now the effort to destroy my wedding. She assured me she would handle it. She couldn't believe what my parents were doing. She came in as promised. She contacted various family members to clear the air and ensure them understood the truth, that my parents were the ones at fault here and that I had done nothing wrong. Her support meant everything to me. She even posted on social media stating that the reason she had modified her will had nothing to do with me pressing her and everything had to do with how my parents had treated me. At last, individuals were beginning to realize the reality. Gradually but definitely, the tide started to change. More family members contacted me to apologize for thinking the worst of me, and some even cut off contact with my parents completely, disgusted by their actions. But my parents' reaction was not good. They really tightened their assault focus. They began accusing Aunt Susan of being overly harsh and irrational, and of preferring me over them. They said I was separating the family and creating a gulf between them and everyone else. By now, though, I was bored with their games. Thanks to Aunt Susan, I blocked them on every platform. I stopped wanting to hear from them. I didn't need them in my life if they were going to keep being nasty. Though it wasn't an easy decision, Caleb and I agreed that we would go with our wedding without them, and that, should it mean, we would have to break connections with Rachel and my parents permanently. I was not going to allow them to destroy this for me. The closer we came to the wedding, the more I realized just how dramatically my life had changed in the course of a few months. My wedding day was intended to be a celebration of love, not a battlefield for family strife. From being a constant in my life, my parents and Rachel had become strangers I couldn't even identify. One could not travel back to the past and find things the same. Though it was somewhat different from what we had first envisioned, Caleb and I kept organizing our wedding after they had made their decision. Rather than a big family gathering, it turned into a private occasion with friends and the few relatives who had stayed faithful to us through the tumult. Naturally, Aunt Susan came first on that list. 2 weeks before the wedding, Aunt Susan dropped over to finish the arrangements. Without her, I'm not sure how I would have done everything. Given all the upheaval around the matter with my parents, she was more thrilled than I had ever seen her. This was consoling. Her voice calm but forceful as we discussed the seating arrangements and other details drew me aside to tell me something almost knocked me off. "Emma, I've decided to officially update my will," she said. I blinked, totally startled, then left most of my estate to you. "Wait, Aunt Susan, you are not required to do that. This whole affair wasn't about the inheritance. I never meant to stand between you and Dad." She grinned at me and shook her head. "Emma, I am aware of it. This is not about your father or his actions, though. This centers on me. I have seen your dad treat me with contempt for years, thinking I would always be there to save him just because we are family. I had no idea what to say. He has never really exhibited any desire in keeping a relationship unless it served him. Though I had always loved Aunt Susan, hearing her lay everything out like this made me understand how much she had been keeping back for years. "This isn't about money, Emma," she said. "This relates to respect. Never expecting anything in return, you have always handled me with compassion and care. For this reason, I want you to acquire my estate when I die. I was stunned since you are the only one who has ever really cared, not because of the problems with your parents. I had never wanted this whole situation to descend to inheritance, but I knew that this was Aunt Susan's way of taking control of her own life and making sure her legacy passed to someone who really respected her." "I don't know what to say," I eventually said. "I appreciate you," but Aunt Susan laughed, truly hoping we wouldn't be talking about this for very long. "Emma, don't worry, not sure where I'm headed anytime soon." I held her hard and had a great sense of thankfulness, simply checking that when the time comes, things are done the proper manner. Aunt Susan had been my rock among all the turmoil. Now she was doing something for me that I could never pay for. As the wedding day drew near, I had an odd spectrum of feelings. Of course, there was buzz. Caleb and I were at last getting married. Still, there remained a residual gloom. Rachel's parents wouldn't be there either, nor would mine. Thought about what had been lost stung, no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. Still, I felt this was the appropriate call of action. Letting them back into my life without an explanation or recognition of their actions would just cause additional suffering. Caleb and I were both humming with excitement early on the wedding morning. The location was lovely, a little garden with a view of the city where we had created so many moments together. As predicted, Aunt Susan arrived early. She also carried a surprise, some distant relatives who had severed relations to my parents upon learning the complete truth. Though we hadn't been close before all of this, they had chosen to come support me. The ceremony itself went perfectly. With Aunt Susan at my side, I strolled down the aisle and looked about to see the people who really mattered there, Caleb, friends, and the family that had supported me. Though it had all I needed, it was hardly the spectacular affair I had envisioned. Caleb stared at me with such great love in his eyes that I felt nothing else counted. All the family drama, all the hurt and treachery vanished at that instant. Then we assembled for the reception, and the last bombshell landed there. One of my cousins approached me looking a little nervous as everyone was mingling and celebrating. "Emma, I thought you should know, but I don't want to ruin your day," she began gently. "Your folks, they showed up." My heart dropped. "What do you suppose they showed up for? Now here." She nodded. "They haven't come in, but they are outside." I didn't know how to feel. They seemed too terrified to really face you. Anger was my immediate reaction. How dare they attempt to ruin my wedding following everything they have done? Benevolent under the rage, though, was another. Though I knew it may never happen, a part of me still yearned for peace. I excused myself and walked outside to find Rachel, my dad, and my mom waiting uneasily by the entrance. I remained there momentarily, simply staring at them. They seemed hesitant of themselves, as if they were waiting for some sort of indication that it was acceptable to come in. Neither did I first. They said nothing at all. At last, Mom raised her voice. "Emma, apologies here." It wasn't the great apology I had hoped for, but it was something. We didn't meant for things to get this far. Their eyes betrayed the shame, particularly in my dad's case. From the last time I'd seen him, he seemed to have aged 10 years. "We didn't come to ruin anything," my dad said. "We wanted to see you married. We missed you. It was an odd time. Part of me wanted to tell them to keep the limits I had set and go. Still, there was a sliver of optimism on another side of me, the one that loved them despite all. Perhaps, just perhaps, this marked the beginning of repairs. Not yet, though. I wasn't ready to forgive them. "You can watch from outside," I murmured, my voice firm. "We are not ready to chat, though. Not today." They nodded, glad I hadn't totally closed the door on them. Caleb and I had a great feeling of serenity as the night drew to an end, and Caleb and I got ready to depart. They watched from a distance as I returned inside to finish celebrating with the individuals who had helped me through all. Although my parents had turned there unannounced, I had managed it in a way that felt appropriate for me. My wedding day had been perfect. Though I hadn't given in, I also hadn't totally excluded them. There was still a long road ahead, and I had no idea what my relationship with my parents would hold. Still, I felt like I was in charge, first in a long time. As Caleb and I drove off into the evening, I looked across at him and grinned. I had established limits and stood up for myself. It felt like a win. We were beginning our life together, and I felt I had made the correct decisions whether or not my family suffered. That was enough. This was the start of something different, something I could construct on my own terms.